In the outset, when we're considering these concepts and terms, particularly the term white passing is tied to another reality and another whakapapa and another history. And it's arrived here through the sharing of media, but it didn't start from here, which is a bit of a conflict when you're trying to create a discussion about Te Ao Māori perspectives. But we're not starting from a Te Ao Māori, not starting from our own tūranga waiwai. And even the term white passing, you're reaching into somebody else's history and you're invoking somebody else's history. And history it's not just history, it's loaded with mamae, it's loaded with intergenerational consequences, it's loaded with people's stories, it's loaded with people's identities. And so you're invoking that, and the term white passing invokes a history that includes ongoing harm and extreme harm. I question our right to be able to invoke that harm in others. It was unnecessary, I guess, as a starting point. The starting point for us around some of these terms is really around what it is to be kiritea in a world that has been shaped by racism. And that is our tūranga waiwai for this discussion. And then you can branch off into discussions around white passing. So the term white passing, when you look at it, it's pass for what? Before white passing, there were other terms like free passing. The pass related to a pass from being lynched, a pass from being enslaved, a pass from all of the horrors of that experience. We have our own horrific experiences in our whakapapa, but not all of that is ours. It's not our experience. It doesn't sit in our bones, doesn't shape our destinies in particular ways. That whole term of white passing, you've got to think, well, it passed from what and whose history am I invoking? And do I have the right to do that? And do I have the capacity to walk that journey as well, to see that discussion through to the end? Because we don't share all of that same history, it's not the strongest starting point for that discussion. The history that we do share can flow from a discussion around kiritea, and then I think that's the more appropriate space to talk about how that might connect to other theories and other themes that come from other lands.
Yeah, so when you talk about starting from the concept of kiritea and then how that connects to other histories, to other concepts from elsewhere, then we can think about these violent racist structures that were kind of put over these lands, and white supremacy, settler colonialism, some of the concepts that come out of those discussions. And while white passing might not be the appropriate frame, if we look at authors who have written about settler colonialism, they'll say things like, the important question in a settler colony is who counts as white. So that might have been a framing that would be more appropriate for this context. So people that might have been racialized elsewhere in the world get to come to this land, get to be considered white, and therefore get to benefit from the spoils of settler colonial violence and disposition of Māori in these lands. So
and being mindful that a lot of the positioning that comes out of that history also is pre-civil rights movement, the Black Panthers movement and the education and anti-racist movements that came out of the 60s and 70s, which really shaped at a global level, which we also benefit from, the growth in our awareness and the evolution of our critical consciousness around how race shapes us, shapes our reality, that it is inescapable because it shapes our social reality and experience. So I say it's inescapable, but also people who are racialized as white or experience colorism and have had, race socially assigned to them as well, whether they feel that way or not. It can happen without you even knowing it. And so the way in which people experience this is different based on how they present, whether or not they present as looking at a distance like a Pākehā or looking at a distance like, being dark-skinned Māori or wherever it is you come from. So that will inform your lived experience, whether you're aware of it or not, because it shaped all of society. And we've only come to appreciate that because of the growth of the discipline and the movement. And people have died in that movement. People have given their lives to advance our understanding of how race shapes our experience in this world. And we owe it to the people who have given their lives and given their time and their blood and their sweat and their tears to develop this understanding, to be able to respect it, which kind of brings me to the thoughts around how, particularly in social media, it's just such a short, grabby opportunity to delve into something. And it's a great space to raise awareness. It's a great space to catalyze a conversation or catalyze a learning journey. It's not a great space to carry out your learning journey within, because these disciplines and these understandings do carry so much mamae, and there have been such strong contributions to it. And we do need to pay respect to the discipline that's been developed and the intersections of that space. So where does the discipline, for instance, or somebody like Malcolm X and his review, how does that intersect with the knowledge of tino rangatiratanga, mana motu hake? And what is our reflection of that space as well? So how do these things come together? And importantly, how do these things come apart? So it's not all of that is my space to speak to, but we can talk about, some of our shared spaces as well. So I think because everybody feels that they experience racism, that provides their own ability to be able to feed into that, which is great. But if we're trying to talk about integrity in these discussions and grow a space of integrity for these discussions, then that has to come with critical consciousness, which requires wānanga. Wānanga is not something you can get in a 3-minute TikTok clip or a 2-minute or 140 character tweet or all of these social media spaces. They're great for catalyzing conversation. Yeah, there's challenges there too. These concepts are on the lips of our rangatahi and everybody, and they're also being utilised in ways that can cause great harm. We also always need to think about ethically and, considering under the concepts of manaaki, who is it that's materially, physically experiencing the greatest harm in this context? And so, for instance, the harm that can be invoked by erasing the people who are most impacted by white supremacy, and you erase that causes harm. You might not hear about it as much. Yeah, there's a lot of harm that can be created when the people who experience it the most are decentered and are not acknowledged in that space as well.
I have a tipuna who was enslaved from Africa, and his grandchild migrated to Aotearoa, and we grew up hearing that we had Spanish ancestry. I just felt like I had to bring that into the room, so I'm not excluding that. But at the same time, I still would not claim to really carry that, and understand what it means to be white passing in that way. The closest I can think really around where that concept relates to the experience of Māori, even though it's still not appropriate to discuss it in this way, I don't think, but just our babies being stolen by the state and then given out to other whānau, where there seems to be this hierarchy based on the colour of the child, and this tendency to have families pretend that this child is Spanish or something that counts as white here, so there is this ugly history that we grapple with, but it's still a different history from where that concept comes from of being white passing. You can understand why people struggle to talk about this in some ways, because it's much easier to have an understanding and to recognise when you are being racialised, when you are experiencing racism. It's a lot more difficult to understand or to detect when white supremacy is operating through us. It's harder to see, for example, when I went to high school, I got a detention within the first couple of weeks and realised I couldn't hang out with those Māori girls over there, but I had the privilege of being able to camouflage myself in a particular way to avoid trouble. That's not something that I understood was happening at that time, but I understand it now, and that not everybody, when they get pulled over by the police, not everybody can put on their Pākehā voice and have a good outcome from that experience. It's something that we're much better at identifying when people are being racist to us than when we're benefiting from being fair-skinned.
Yeah, and so there's these differences between being white presenting and being racialized, or being subject to what people term as socially assigned race, and how people identify you even from a distance, and this term white passing, which has a really specific history rooted in Jim Crow era, rooted in the one drop rule, rooted in a history of extreme mumai that we are transferring over to our discussions. And so, there's being white presenting or being racialized as white. It's a different framing for the discussion. And then I think, when you also introduce what it is to be kiritea, then what you're doing is that you are claiming and affirming your whakapapa within the discussion of being kiritea in a way that gets missed if you frame it around any of those other concepts, but especially white passing. And that then starts to move towards those spaces where, the discussion starts to move towards where some of our whānau, when you want to have these discussions, feel that their whakapapa is being assaulted. Yeah, but being kiritea opens up a different discussion which acknowledges at the very outset that your whakapapa is untouchable. Yeah. He Māori tonu koe, aha koa tō kiri. He Māori kiritea koe, he Māori tonu koe. So, yeah, that's a really important distinction to make between using a term that is rooted in a particular history that is not of this land, and the harm that can create. And some of these adjacent terms around, like presenting, socially assigned, race, and then what it is to be kiritea, Māori kiritea.
And even when we have those experiences, I think a more relevant discourse here is the good Māori, bad Māori kind of discourse. So even those Māori like myself who are able to kind of code switch to kind of go undetected in certain spaces, when that happens with me, like if I get pulled over by the police, I'm not pretending that I'm not Māori. I'm just trying to be a good Māori, to avoid getting a ticket or whatever it might be, to not appear threatening, but because I'm fair-skinned, if I speak a particular way, I can be viewed as non-threatening. Whereas for darker-skinned Māori or for other dark-skinned racialized people who experience anti-black racism, they don't have that. It doesn't matter how they would speak or behave, they still get kind of seen as a threat or seen as criminal in some way.
Actually, it can make it, in some instances, it plays against you, because if I believe that your place is in a dumb person because of my racist beliefs, then actually I think you're being cheeky by trying to sound smart. You have no right to try and speak in an intelligent way. You have no right to present in that way. And so regardless of how articulate you are, actually your articulation can play against you if my expectation is that you play the role that I've assigned to you in my head because I've racialized you. And that is not something that anybody, with light skin has to contend with in their lived experience. And even as a wahine maumoko, for me, even well before I received my moko or received any of my markings, my pathway was shaped and defined through how I present to the rest of the world and how the world interprets how I present based on the fact that we live in a world that's influenced by race. So the privilege that I bring that can also come up in the fact that I was able to have a particular pathway through university and avoid particular treatment. You don't know what you don't know. People don't know what they have avoided by virtue of the fact that they've avoided it. So all of the different types of maltreatment that I avoided in my pathway through my life that shaped and provided privilege for me to access the education, for me to access some of my employment, for me to access the privilege that I've had, that comes through in how I articulate myself. All of that has been shaped by how I present and the whiteness of the systems around us that nobody gets to escape. And so even though ahakoa he wahine mai moko mo, I've still been shaped by it before I received my moko as well. So everybody has an experience about things, and racism is one of those issues that, because it touches so many lives, everybody has a view on it, but experience is not consciousness. Consciousness is consciousness. I think that was possibly one of the early issues, was around the consciousness of that particular topic. And to be fair and frank, that was admitted. That was said at the outset, at the beginning. So then it was, how do you then chart a pathway through that discussion if that consciousness is not there about it?
Because is that where the danger sits?
I think that's absolutely where a lot of the danger sits online. At the moment, I think we are experiencing a lot of the harm and risk, which is probably at a higher level than I've ever seen, around our ability to come together and mobilise around a particular issue. You know, that's a huge risk at the moment, because we're not even clear on what the issues are. That's the power and the potential of what this project is that it can, call attention to some of these key issues that we do need to mobilise and have some critical understanding around, so that we can position ourselves as Māori. So yeah, it's a great risk when we're not getting our lead from that in the space that is immersed in that particular topic.
Yeah, and I think we talked about the danger of having these conversations without people most affected by anti-blackness or colorism. No one really wants to listen probably to fair-skinned people talking about how hard it is to be fair-skinned. And, so for some kaupapa, you're aware of what you don't know, and so you don't step into it. Race is not one of those kaupapa. Race is one of those kaupapa where we all feel, because of the way in which we experience it, especially as Māori. And, a really important practice when we're talking into this space is to de-centre yourself, and to realise, you need to centre the impacts upon the people most impacted by anti-blackness or by colorism. That can be a big call to make for Māori, because we've been decentered from our own reality for so long. We've always had colonisers centering themselves, and so we've fought for so many generations to centre ourselves that it's a difficult practice to decenter yourself in any particular conversation. So, I recognise and respect that it's a difficult call to ask people to decenter yourself, but I also believe that is a mark of rangatiratanga, and manaaki is also, we have these practices of decentering ourselves. We just need to apply that in this context to decenter yourself in that discussion, and consider who it is that experiences the most material harm here, and whether or not I have enough skin in the game to be able to contribute constructively to it. Because there's lots of kind of ways in which Māori experience racism that are unique to us and experienced at the collective level as well. So not having access to language or speaking te reo, and having to fight for spaces to be able to use your reo, land disposition, dealing with Crown agencies, dealing with local government, all of these things give Māori a particular insight into a particular form of colonial racism.
Yeah.
But that then doesn't translate into having an understanding about how your individual experience with a particular skin that you're in, how the skin that you're in shapes your experience everywhere you go. So I think there is kind of the blind spot there, that people just think about themselves at the collective level without thinking about how those individual differences can really change your experience and what areas are safe for you to be in.
Yeah, absolutely. And, the discussions, particularly the learnings and the advancement that we have gotten from the likes of Angela Davis and Malcolm, the leaders of the civil rights movement. We've drawn so much from that, but we don't delve into what we've drawn from them and what we owe to that movement, and at the very least, the respect that we owe to step back from some of those spaces that aren't ours. You don't even know where is appropriate to be able to step back until you spend some time in understanding its contribution to anti-racism around the world, not just from our Black brothers and sisters in the United States and Canada and or Great Turtle Island, but also from Africa as well, and the movement, the work of Steve Biko, and in acknowledging the contribution that they've made to the global understanding of racism, and then understanding where that intersects with our experience as well is a really important part of paying tribute to what they've done without taking from it in a way that's, demonstrates entitlement.
Mm. And some of the ways that kind of plays out in our daily lives, Donna Awatere's 1984 text, Māori Sovereignty, has some really key insights in it when she's talking about colonial Māori. And she's not just talking about the colour of someone's skin, but also their proximity to whiteness in terms of, if for those of us who have a white parent, and the privilege, the social capital, in some cases wealth that is associated with that. And she's very clear about the opportunities that are just given to fair-skinned Māori, palatable Māori, and how anyone who is given access to that power and privilege does so on the backs of Māori who don't get afforded those privileges.
Yeah.
And indeed other racialised people here now. Yeah. Mm. And that's probably another thing as well, is that Aotearoa has changed a lot in the last 20 years. Where I grew up, it was one of the least diverse places in the country. It was pretty much mostly just Pākehā and Māori, and very few Māori. And so our understanding needs to catch up to the country as it is today, and the sensitivities that we have to have today, and the learning that we have to do across different communities today.
Yeah, absolutely. And you reminded me of the fact that, a part of this is also because we as a nation have never invested in anti-racist education in the same way that they have in other nations. So we haven't grown our own critical tool set to be able to identify where the different lanes are and how this might be impacted or received by other groups. Those critical tool sets are present in other places. And so, that's how you can have people who, have come here from like the deep south of the United States, which, where people would classically expect them to experience racism, and are shocked at the levels of racism that they experience here in Aotearoa. And that in part is because we haven't been driving some of these conversations through our education or on our media. We haven't been providing each other in our communities with the critical tools to be able to navigate these conversations in a way that's sensitive to who is impacted by it. I just think it's also a testament to multiple generations that have failed to invest in the critical tools. It's not that they aren't there. We have generations of our own scholars and our own people who have worked to raise awareness about this, included it in their own university curriculums as well. But coming up through the school system, it's not been well supported by the state, which has fed into, I think, some of the dynamics that we see here today. It's an important discussion. It's an overdue discussion, but it's also an under-supported discussion as well. I think even if we are looking at wānanga, Palanoa, we can't avoid anti-racism as a movement and understanding these issues and discussing these issues and forging solutions. A big part of the problem is that for a long time the word race and the concept of race is a dirty word. And it was taken out and it was erased. There are people who are even averse to using the term anti-racism, even though that as a movement, there's been bloodshed around it. People have fought for that. And actually the point of anti-racism is acknowledging that it thrives in the shadows. Racism thrives in the shadows. Racism thrives in absence of critical discussion and shining a light on it. Pointing to it and talking about what it is a big part of the process. And so I think we do have these tools of understanding it, but those tools also intersect with anti-racist theory. So if you look at some of the work of, Koka Tuhiwai Smith and Matua Hingangaroa, and also across Te Moananui Kiwa Haunani Kei Trask, for a long time have been looking at the intersections of tino rangatiratanga, mana motuhake, mana moana, and our rights as well. Importantly, there's a difference between Indigenous rights and civil rights as well. So we need to have these wānanga in tandem. The concepts need to be explored in tandem so that we can see civil rights are rooted in ideas of citizenship. Indigenous rights are rooted in whakapapa to the whenua. And there's spaces where they cross over and intersect and share, and then there's spaces obviously where they diverge as well. So I think the point is I would caution against having these discussions in absence of anti-racism and understanding of anti-racism, but you have these wānanga in tandem with each other, and also to recognise the huge contribution that has been made to our understanding of these spaces from around the world.
So we had the civil rights movement in the US, and then the expression we had here was like Ngata matua, and our fight for our treaty rights. So since then we've had a lot of treaty education,
Yes.
but not a lot of anti-racism education. And one of the first kind of steps, I think, to broadening our understanding would be for us in our treaty education or in whatever space you're learning about these things is to understand that colonialism is not a local process.
Yeah.
To understand that it's a global process, to understand how it impacts our whanaunga across the Pacific, to understand how it impacts people in the global south or the third world, and how displacement of people leads to people being here in Aotearoa and still being discriminated and racialised. And understanding that as a global system, understanding colonialism and imperialism as a global system, I think is a step towards us as Māori understanding how different people are racialised and how white supremacy can operate through us.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think in the first attempt at this discussion, we did talk about what does it take for me to be a safe space for others to engage in this discussion with me. And a huge part of that is understanding that the colonial racism that we experience is a part of a global project that stretches back centuries. And at the very outset of that, we have connections to the history of our black brothers and sisters. We have connections to the West African slave trade, so we can honour our intersections when we have a greater, deeper understanding of those connections, and also where our paths diverge as well. And similarly, looking across Te Moananui Kiwa with the histories of blackbirding and how that connects to that story as well, we're able to better position ourselves so that we can stand in solidarity with each other in a way that is safe, because we need solidarity to be able to get through this. We're going to need solidarity, and we deserve that solidarity. It is an amazing, beautiful and powerful thing where we can stand next to each other as, siblings and correctly identify, actually, you're not my adversary. You've been placed here by the same forces that oppress me, and let's stand together and face the actual adversary. But in order to do that in a way that's, robust and strong for us to stand in our strength in that space, we need to respect each other's difference. Like, that's the beauty of kotahitanga for me, is that kotahitanga is not about saying that we're the same. It's about equal respect for each other's differences and understanding where we differ so that we can truly stand by each other.
And to be clear, the adversary is not white peoples.
Yeah.
So much as colonialism, imperialism, capitalism,
Yes.
these violent and oppressive systems.
Yes, absolutely. And that is a system that disadvantages the vast majority of white people as well.
Exactly.
You know, it's a system it's deeply capitalist and hierarchical and classist. And the only people who really benefit from that system is like a very small percentage
Of transnational capitalists.
yes, of transnational capitalists. And so there's a lot of space for solidarity in that. But you're only going to reach that solidarity through deep wānanga around yourself, decentering yourself, not making it about your own feelings, decentering yourself, going into deep wānanga with each other and respecting each other's different experiences and spaces so that you can hold some sensitivity in your stand. So for me, the discussion around being kiritea Māori, again, if you utilise the tool of decentering yourself, your feelings and your personal experiences, it's an acknowledgement that whiteness is a social force that can influence you even when you have whakapapa Māori. And that is, for me, the starting point of the discussion. You know, is that it's a social force. We're not talking about your whakapapa or cultural dislocation, which is also, you know, a journey that you can chart your pathway through and can be healed as well through your journey. So that's a different discussion. The discussion point that we're starting around being kiritea, or Māori kiritea, particularly in relation to whiteness, is an acknowledgement that as Māori kiritea, you still receive a particular type of treatment moving through a racialised world, and that doesn't have anything to say about your whakapapa. And then the next point, can you just restate the question in relation to cultural dislocation? Because for me it doesn't infer cultural dislocation, which is, I guess, you know, what Tamati was talking about, is that being kiritea doesn't necessarily infer cultural dislocation. For me, the discussion around being kiritea is that you are acknowledging and stepping into the fact that you have a racialized experience in this world that doesn't reflect your whakapapa.
Yeah, they're two very different things, being fair-skinned versus being culturally disconnected.
Yeah.
And I think there is this importance of decentering ourselves, because we often hear the voices of people who are fair-skinned and disconnected saying, you know, when I go home, people think I'm Pākehā or something. And that for them is a painful experience. But it's not easy to move about the world being recognisably Māori and disconnected from your culture either.
Yeah.
In that way, you're kind of like doubly marginalised, you know? So, yeah, I think we need to understand that those are two very different things.
Yes.
And that being disconnected from your culture is always hard, is always difficult.
Yeah, absolutely. And when you hear our whanaunga who are racialised in that way, and the expectations that are placed upon them, yeah, you can do today's karakia, can you lead us about this? Can you give us advice on the pōrere?
Yeah.
You are so much more likely to receive a lot of those expectations as somebody who is clearly racialised as being Māori.
Yeah.
And that is also another aspect to be talked about as well, which is, different to being culturally disconnected. Yeah, I agree. The two things are should be approached separately. We often talk about the amount of anti-racist energy that goes into helping people who are racialised as white feel better about themselves and feel better about their experience and work out their pathway through this world, when that energy could, for us, also be spent within our own communities. And I think that is a part of what allows lateral and internalised violence to flourish. So, you have your internalized violence against your own people who share your identity and your experience through this world. So for me as Māori, if I have internalized narratives about being not worthy, about being lesser than, about being savage or brutish or staunch or promiscuous, or all of these kind of violent projections and racist projections, and I have internalized that by virtue of the fact that it's arrived at me daily, by the minute, through media and through education, through the inferences that are made of systems and the way people talk about you. You internalize some of those ideas, and then you will get angry at other people for speaking above their station, because who are you to talk like that? And who am I also to aspire to be this or to aspire to be that? So that's when you internalize that violent rhetoric, and that's the internal violence, and you can visit internalized violence against people of your own community. And there is the lateral violence that you can visit against people who are marginalized but not of your community. Again, you have taken on board these other ideas about, members of the Asian community based on racist ideas around Asian people. You can take on ideas against communities of colour, Muslim populations, based upon racist rhetoric that you've heard, and then visit that violence against them as well. Just to come back to the point that you made earlier, pōtaka around how did we get here? How did we get to this point? A part of the issue is that we haven't spent time having these discussions internally, and it's a difficult discussion to have in public, because then other people can weaponize it against us. They'll start to confuse it and go, oh, but you're being racist, you're being reverse racist, or you're being racist against white people and all of that. So it's an internal discussion and a wānanga for us to have with each other, but it's difficult to carve that space out when we're always talking about racism as being about colonisers against everybody else. You know what I mean? So yeah, definitely lateral and internalised violence and lateral and internalised racism has allowed to flourish within Māori and other marginalised communities in a way that's, it stands in the way of us being able to be safe and stand in solidarity with each other. And that's because, a lot of the anti-racist energy has been placed upon Pākehā groups trying to feel better about themselves. Oh, yeah, I do want to say something else. Racism and white supremacy is an issue that has been put in place over multiple centuries. It is replete throughout our economic systems, throughout our global relationships, our trade systems, our political systems, our education, media, police orders, it's everywhere. We've got a long journey ahead of us, and there's going to be a lot of hapa along that journey. And the point is never going to be, we have to be faultless in everything that we do. The point is, how do you respond to it when people raise that something has not been approached properly? It's about what are you going to do about that so that we can correct our trajectory and continue on that pathway rather than abandoning it. I think it's really important to highlight the response to critique, the response to complaint. Sarah Ahmed's work around complaint, it talks about how where people do speak up about something, so often power, which is also linked to race, but so often power is wielded in a way that you have the ability to be able to ignore their complaint, you have the ability to be able to reframe their complaint, you have the ability to be able to make them the problem, as opposed to really reflecting on what could be said better or differently or done better or differently. There's a power wielding in that dynamic. And so, I just think we have to, in all of these discussions, be mindful that this is, we've got a big journey ahead, and it's an urgent journey as well, because it is tied into issues to do with climate and justice and harm and conflict and military, misogyny, fascism, transphobia, big problems, big issues that we want to tidy up for our mokopuna. So we need to continue to come back to the table and pursue the discussion and have open and frank kōrero around it as well. So, yeah, it's the response to concerns and hapa along the way that I think is really going to determine our pathway as well.
Yeah, because we all mess up, eh?
Yeah.
So it's all about how you respond when someone tells you you've made a mistake.
And, you know, I so value some of the aunties who run my ears over the years over something that has been harmful, and the immediate instinct is to get defensive or to shut it down or to avoid it, because if you can often have the privilege to just shut it down and avoid it, but you don't grow. That's not how you grow. So you grow by listening to it, really deeply considering what can be done about it, and having another shot at it, giving it another shot.
The hard lessons are often the most important ones.
Yeah, absolutely.